On February 16, 2005, the Los Angeles Times Daily newspaper published an article which immediately became the world sensation. In the article, American pensioner Herbert Lee Stivers, former Nuremberg prison guard, stated it was he who had killed Hermann Goering. According to him precisely, he delivered an ampoule of cyanic potassium to the cell where Goering had been kept. If it were a complete truth, then the secret of the murder of Nazi number 2 would have been revealed. But there appeared new details in the matter, placing the confession of the pensioner for doubt and giving an impetus in investigating a most mysterious suicide of the 20th century. Hermann Goering had been declared a successor of Hitler in the lifetime of the latter, but in reality became most important only at the Nuremberg trials, on the bench of the defendants. This trials process, known as the Court of History, lasted for almost a year, and during all that time the name of Goering had been printed in newspapers. Even his personal acquaintances were surprised by his courage and self-control. Even his enemies respected him. As Sir Norman Bill, Nuremberg trials deputy chairman, had noted, Goering prevails at the hearings, mastering the situation completely. If we do not restrain him, the entire court trial will go badly. They had restrained Goering, but in a while he drew attention to his personality once again, having taken poison 2 hours prior to his execution.
There was a constant rumor that something should have been wrong with the Goering suicide, but no one ever attempted to demonstrate its impossibility logically through a chain of proofs. In principle, just one proof should have been sufficient. It would be enough to look through the documents of the Nuremberg trials to understand the structure of guarding the Nazi criminals after the suicide of Ley.
While the petition of Goering to replace hanging with shooting had been deflected, there was indisputable logic in accomplishing suicide. For as he wrote in his death note, they do not hang up marshals. Thus, there is an impression he had deceived everyone, including death, and perished as a conqueror. The historians are still bewildered by the secret of his suicide, wondering who gave him the poison, an American officer, the doctor, or maybe his wife at the moment of a farewell kiss. Also, there was an American soldier by the name of Herbert Lee Stivers, whose girl could have asked to forward some medicine to sick Goering. All these versions are quite curious, but is it possible to assume any of them seriously?
After the suicide of Robert Ley, head of the Working Front, further suicides became impossible at Nuremberg. Firstly, it had been a very big scandal, so that the matter of guarding the Nazi criminals was taken under personal control of the heads of the states. Winners from the Soviet side, for instance, it was Stalin. While previously the Nazis had been essentially guarded by only one side, after the accident with Ley, these tactics were replaced by a bond of two, where one side achieved basic guard and another one ensured its control.
The mother of Goering once said that Hermann Goering would become either a great personality or a great criminal. In 1945, the prisoner of cell number 5 still considered himself to be a great person. But the rest of mankind knew him as criminal number 1. In the cell, Goering had sufficient time to recall all the details of his life, full of adventures and terror.
This was an extremely uneasy and contradictory personality, incredibly arrogant. To satisfy his ambitions, he could step over any principles.
At the Nuremberg trials, attorney Stammer asked his client to describe his biography in brief. "I had been brought up in an ordinary way," Goering began. domestic teacher first, military school second, service in the Army as officer. In October 1914, I piloted reconnaissance aircrafts, then the bombers. By autumn 1915, a fighter pilot, I was heavily wounded in an air battle. Having recovered, started commanding a troop of fighters. Then was appointed commander of the Reichshofen Squadron, the one well known at that time.
По масштабу своей личности Геринг, конечно, был человеком общегерманского.
As to his personality, Goering surely was a man of all German or even pan-European scale.
Человеком номер два в какой-то период существования.
Actually, he had been number two.
И в самый последний.
And in the period of the Nuremberg trials, he became number one.
Нюрнбергского процесса.
Goering met the First World War with happiness, hoping for glory, ranks, and awards. By 1917, he was already a well-known high-class fighter pilot and a famous hero. He obtained rewards. The newspapers kept writing about him. But the war ended with the defeat of Germany and the burst out of the revolution. There emerged red bows on the overcoats of soldiers, red flags, meetings. Goering was in depression. He had no biography, for no one needed all his military exploits and rewards, as well as his 22 downed aircrafts. The Germans had aversion to everything related to the war. He had no work. All he was capable of doing was piloting. But according to the conditions of the Versailles Agreement, Germany had no right to have military aircrafts available. The native, beloved country Goering had been proud of had gone.
Goering was an extremely vain person. This is completely obvious. He dreamed to become a top politician, and relation with Hitler provided him with such an opportunity. Goering understood that if they were together, nothing will have stopped them, so that eventually they will have taken the lead. In this regard, these two seem to have found each other.
Every day at Nuremberg, they escorted Goering along the same long corridors towards the hall of court sessions. The accusers and judges studied his biography well. Mr. Goering, when did you join the Nazis? When did he join the Nazis? This occurred in 1922. The same year, Goering was introduced to Hitler, whom he had heard earlier, and like thousands of people had been fascinated by his speeches. I had a feeling the words of Hitler were flowing out of my soul, Goering used to say. It is worth mentioning that Hitler's ideas would have occupied not more than just a few lines on a sheet of paper. These were the guilt of the communists and the Jews in everything, and necessity in breaking the Versailles Agreement instead of complaining about its injustice. But the word power, pronounced by the German leader, warmed up the heart of Goering. In January 1943, Goering headed the Hitler's fighters. I stretched my hand to Hitler, saying, I trust my fate to you in happiness and unhappiness, good times and poor, even if it were necessary to pay for it with my life.
To demonstrate that his party had been consisting of not only lumpens, Hitler was in need of a person like Goering, a true hero of the war. Due to enormous ambitions and energy shown by Goering at the party work, they immediately started advancing him to higher positions.
The beer putsch in Munich cracked his life in two pieces. Being wounded in his groin, Goering became heavily sick. At an Austrian clinic, they had split him morphine, so that afterwards it was extremely uneasy for him to get rid of the habit of drugs. And eventually, only the course of a severe treatment at a psychiatric hospital brought positive results. Alongside, there occurred a hormone shift having led to a swift weight gain. In 1945, Goering surrendered to the Americans. When after the press conference and friendly parties with the American officers, he was finally brought into prison. the commandant saw an affected old man with 2 trunks of tablets. Goering seemed so ridiculous that the commandant could not realize in what way he had been holding half of Europe in fear. But sometimes an appearance is deceptive. Even Hitler recognized that Goering had unique talents. When it was only necessary, the Führer kept saying, this person could be as cold as ice. Moreover, it was this affected, fat man who had led Hitler to power via political trade and aristocratic salons, where they assumed and recognized only Goering.
At all these receptions, Goering felt like a fish in water, in contrast to Hitler, who neither could bear dress coats nor was fond of high society chatter. And Goering, just so easy, having said over a cup of coffee a couple of compliments to the wife of an American economist, obtained another sum of money for Germany, which had been surviving on the American loans for a certain period of time, especially on the eve of the war.
It was Goering who succeeded to persuade Field Marshal Hindenburg in appointing Hitler Chancellor. As Goebbels wrote in his diary, it was an undoubtable hour of the greatest triumph in the life of Goering, who had been laying the road for the Führer through infinite and harassing negotiations for many years. The reasonableness of Goering, his energy, and, first of all, his force of character became obvious and worth admiring. According to Goebbels, that honest soldier with the heart of a child had delivered for Hitler the greatest in his life information.
Hitler
by no means underestimated Goering.
Уже во время войны, когда там время от времени он там орал на Геринга, обвиняя его в больших провалах,
Though later on, during the war already, the Führer could have shouted at him, accusing him of failures.
Геринга. Он уже ничего не может, он уже, так сказать, не может ничего сделать.
Never Iron Hermann had been removed from his post, even contrary to the advices.
Герман, я помню, как он действовал в 1933 году.
Goering was fond of luxury, and no one could have forbidden him to. He loved bright dressings, though entire Germany had been laughing at his passion to changing clothes. But in spite of it all, he wore vividly blue uniforms with a hunting knife on his belt and used to decorate his hat with a peacock feather.
Он сразу же понял, что
He immediately understood that under new regime, as well as under any regime in principle, the one who controlled secret services had the power, including auxiliary ranks in the composition of the police. Goering had it increased at once. There was the SS ranks. Then he arranged energetic and quite resultive hunting, the ones dissatisfied, like communists and social democrats.
The trial started on November 20th, 1945, and continued until October 1st, 1946. During all this time, Goering had been kept in the cell of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, counting 4 meters from the door to the window and 3 meters from wall to wall. There was a table, a chair, and a water closet at his disposal. The idea of the International Court of Justice did not please the Nazi leaders at all. The attraction of foreign activists to the trials is an unprecedented historical impudence, shouted Goering. This is the way the conquerors are punishing the conquered. Just half a year ago, in May 1945, he had been confident things would have gone differently. He thought Eisenhower would talk to him as marshal to marshal. He hoped he, Goering, would sign the peace treaties, becoming the leader of New Germany. He believed they would treat him as the head of the conquered state.
An extremely tough person, Goering was not the one capable to perform suicide. After all, he thought he had things to live for.
having attracted the attention of the entire humanity. The Nuremberg trials actually had been the process of the century. Guarding and keeping Goering, its organizers paid attention to every trifle. After the mysterious suicide of defendant Ley, at the very beginning of the process, there arose a scandal. The Soviet representatives in particular required intensifying the guard, and the Nuremberg administration did everything they could to avoid repetition of anything of the kind. Moreover, the Allies had been controlling not only the prisoners, but also each other. Goering had absolutely no chance to hide anything anywhere, and no one had a possibility to deliver anything for him. Then perhaps it was a murder. But who would have found it necessary to kill a man 2 hours prior to his execution? It seems his death became the last riddle of Hermann Goering.
His
behavior before the Nuremberg trials caused respect of his opponents. Really, Goering had built up his position in a most transparent way, never trying to justify himself, and eventually nearly broke up the trials. Of course, his solid position did influence his companions in arms on the bench of defendants.
As soon as he was allowed to speak, Goering immediately said he would have never shifted responsibility for his actions on Hitler. Having pointed out the Führer had been number 1 in Germany, Goering called himself number 2, describing with pleasure his services to the Nazis. Such as helping the Führer to eliminate enemies of the Reich, preparing the industry of Germany to the war, and creating Luftwaffe. He avoided answering questions on personal participation in the crimes of the Nazi regime, saying something like, "I knew nothing about that, was absent, never signed it, was on vacations, or fell ill." Before the trials, Goering was always in the center of attention. Even in the case where he himself was not speaking but someone else, he nodded favorably when he liked the speech and shook his head when he disliked it. By gestures and mimicry, he reacted to everything occurring in the hall, trying to direct other defendants and requiring subordination from them. Even when walking, he behaved as if he was number 1.
He did convince the majority of the ones hesitating in his personal significance. As you understand it, presence on the bench of defendants had been an enormous stress for each of them. And one day the trial's accusers, quite unexpectedly for themselves, realized that there had been the united bloc on the bench of defendants, formed due to conversations between Goering and his associates. It became quite obvious that, in case this united bloc would have joined the position of Hermann Goering, then the Nuremberg trials process in principle would have been ruined.
Before the trials, they reminded Goering of one of his Tribune speeches, where he had appealed to make murders, having promised to bear his personal responsibility for that. But what on earth do you know about possibilities provided by the evil? You keep speaking about the virtues, while in reality, there is an opposite power ruling the world. Goering answered with a grin. So they had been sitting opposite of each other over there in the hall of the Palace of Justice. The judges and the defendants. Speaking before the trials, Goering never protected himself, but charged the accusers. The U.S. accusers even flung his headsets when Goering charged America in having been repeatedly same aggressor as Germany. Meanwhile, behind the scene of the law courts, there had been a completely different process going on. The one directed by so-called prison psychiatrists. After main sessions, it was their turn to carry out inquiries. They talked to the prisoners while eating, and they attended them in the cells like confessors. While each of the 24 Nuremberg prisoners was a valuable source of information, it would have been naive to assume that the American and British intelligence services weren't tightly working with them. The first principal questions to the defendants were the ones of practical nature, concerning the location of gold, money, and art values.
The matter is that Goering had headed the commission responsible for accounting the subjects of luxury significant for the world culture located in the occupied territories. Therefore, the pragmatic Americans chased this information most of all. For the Brits, secret bank accounts of the Reich had been of greater interest.
There was some Dr. Gilbert who worked with Goering in this regard. Close, even friendly relations were established between the two of them. Returning to his cell after a speech before the trials, Goering behaved as an actor after premieres. Being excited, he rejected food and kept smoking his Bavarian pipe without switching on the light. As he used to say to Dr. Gilbert, those dark moments, man had become the vilest of creatures of the world, and the wars, because of that, were to become more and more bloody and destructive. According to the statements of his companions in arms, Goering had a phenomenal memory. He remembered almost all events, dates, and names of people. He was capable of memorizing at once different numerical sets like bank codes, numbers, or geographical coordinates of, say, some hiding places. But taking information from Goering was practically impossible. Dr. Gilbert, experienced professional, understood clearly that one had no chance to replay Goering, experienced politician. Neither could he be deceived. Only one way was left: purchasing Goering. Before the trials, Goering repeatedly said he had been against the war. And really, there were things for him to lose. But it was the war that offered him possibilities to become increasingly rich, and he did not miss the chance. Competing with Hitler and collecting robbery goods, Goering had profited by getting pictures of old masters from every museum located within the occupied territory. Iron Hermann was one of a kind in collecting robbery goods. It had been a reckless, scaled, and professional robbery, devastating entire countries. As it is known, having instructed the special forces of looters, Goering called them not to be distributed by the fact that millions of Russians would have died out because of mass exporting food supplies. So what would have been the price the Americans would pay to get from him the information required? In his matter, promising just any life was not sufficient. Goering would have agreed to share his secrets only in exchange for a wealthy life of freedom. While the hidden property cost millions of US dollars, Goering realized pretty well the price of the information he was aware of. Alongside, the US intelligence had an interest to German strategic secret agents whose names had been known only by the first persons of the Reich.
Агенты стратегического влияния, они завязываются на первых лиц.
The agents of strategic influence are connected only with the first persons.
Вот таких агентов имел и Геринг. Или, во всяком случае,
The ones of the middle chain do not know anything about them.
Поэтому для американцев и для англичан важно было получить эту информацию.
The Americans and the Brits assumed that Goering had the agents of the kind available and hoped to receive the corresponding information from him while he had been still alive.
Здесь торговля идет как на базаре.
Goering did not know exactly what the Americans had been aware of already, and what they were hoping to get from him. He knew from Dr. Gilbert that Werner von Braun had already been living in the United States working in the field of rocket industry. But to what extent the U.S. intelligence had moved forward searching for the principal German secrets, he was not aware of. Meanwhile, as the one responsible for the 4-year plan implementation and having been chief in aviation, it was Goering who had been conducting most promising and advanced technical projects of the Reich. The Americans knew that the miracle weapon of Hitler was not just a myth to frighten enemies. It existed in reality, at least in drafts.
Вот эти технологии, ноу-хау, военные особенно, представляли...
These very technologies, especially know-how, were the ones of the principal interest.
По легендам получили
According to the legends, the Germans had received information about new kinds of weapons directly from Shambhala. Hitler talked about creating new kinds of weapons to defeat the communism, but he had no time to. Well, they still succeeded in building a flying plate. There were photos of it, and they had sent it fulfilled flights to Tokyo. Of course, Goering knew the location of the factories as well as the engineers busy with the matter.
The Americans did not know that by the end of the war, all participants of these projects had been eliminated. As for the places to hide the corresponding secret documents, one could be confident that Goering would have been aware of them. Of course, in case anything of the kind existed, such information would have been invaluable, and the Americans were ready to stake their reputation on it without taking care of international public opinion. During the trial's process, Goering had been observed and listened to 24 hours a day. There was even a scandal when installing their microphones, the Brits found the ones the Americans originally installed already. But while the Western Allies somehow solved the organizing problems, the Soviet intelligence representatives had no chance to approach the place of interest.
The Americans gave no chance to our intelligence presence at Nuremberg in getting closer. Our representatives felt so jealous about that, they had nothing to do but make assumptions on what was going on over there.
The Soviets and their CIA American colleagues were interested in the same questions. Having agreed on the official inquiry from the Soviet government on conducting the Goering interrogation, the Western Allies insisted on the presence of either American or British representatives. In the process, I mentioned that Goering had no intention to talk to, but as soon as American officers went out to drink some water, he whispered to the translator. He wanted to be questioned without the Ally representative's presence to inform us of something important. But examining Magistrate Lyutashov was not provided with such an opportunity. General Serov informed Minister of Internal Affairs, Lornetti Beria, in his report. It is unknown until today. Either Goering intended to start double dealing to increase his chances to survive, or wanted to explain his reasons of supporting the Soviet intelligence.
There was a Soviet intelligence NKVD agent participating in anti-Hitler activity, a friend of Goering, the one whom the latter hid and saved. Besides, there was Willy Lehman, another bright NKVD personality, the prototype of a popular Soviet cinema spy hero by the name of Shurlitz, written later on by the Russian scriptwriter Ulyan Semenov. That Willy Lehman had been constantly advanced by Goering into the institutions where the latter had no power himself. And eventually, Willy Lehman worked for the Gestapo, having delivered a lot of worthy information from there. In this regard, Goering might even be considered as the one who had protected our agents.
The Soviet topics sounded frequently from Goering when talking to Dr. Gilbert, like, "And now you'll have to drop the Russian giant, and I'd like to watch you do that." In the hall of the court sessions, Goering had to answer concrete questions posed by the Soviet accuser and related to the war of Germany against the Soviet Union. Is the order of branding Soviet prisoners of war known to you? No, this order is unknown to me. Were you aware that prisoners of war as well as ordinary citizens had been assigned by the German command to the works of clearing minefields and carrying over unexploded missiles? I was aware that captured Russian field engineers had been clearing minefields. As for the extent of usage of the citizens in this matter, I was not aware of. Do you know the order about destruction of Leningrad, Moscow, and other cities of the Soviet Union? Only in one document above mentioned, it is said about my presence in the destruction of Leningrad, and only in the sense that in case the Finns obtained Leningrad, they would not have needed such a big city.
хуже большевистского режима в России.
For Goering, the Bolshevik regime in Russia had been the worst thing in the world.
И поставить Россию на колени. Это у Геринга
He had
сомнений.
no doubts about the necessity in destroying this regime and dropping Russia to her knees.
Уничтожение там советских военнопленных, уничтожение коммунистов,
In
расстрел.
other words, elimination of prisoners of war, communists and Jews. For his regime, it was
Это
normal.
было нормальное действие его режима.
At the hearing, the behavior of Goering became more and more demonstrative. He continued to show toughness and self-confidence, feeling a superstar at the immense performance, crowning his political career and ringing down the curtain on his life.
Для Геринга всегда была очень важна поза.
Goering always considered posing to impress public significance.
Как раз во время Нюрнбергского процесса мы имеем воспоминания штатных
As the
тюремных
Nuremberg psychologist recall it, he kept asking, well, how was my speech? Or what was the impression of my speech?
Или опять-таки спрашивал, ну что, правда я...
The public opinion for him has always been extremely important.
Ему это было очень важно.
Before the eyes of the entire world, Goering played the role of a brown hero, resisting his convictions. In fact, trying to deceive everybody to survive. But who needed all this show, with him in the key role? A logic assumption is that Dr. Gilbert, the only confidence interlocutor of Goering, had been pushing him little by little towards such a behavior as a kind of advanced confirmation of his forthcoming free and wealthy life. By the way, other Nazis trying to behave the same way before the trials were abruptly interrupted. Nevertheless, there was a moment on October 17, 1945, when his nerves surrendered to the burden. Hanging around his cell, running against the chair from time to time, stopping, then continuing hanging around. He started all of a sudden talking out loud, addressing to his first wife, dead in 1931. But it was not easy to break Goering. The one who established Gestapo, built the first death camps, and conducted the Nazi intelligence service. Being well aware of all their tricks, hardly had he ever imagined to try some of them on his own skin.
Геринг мог быть нужен нашим союзникам еще по ряду причин.
Our allies could have been in need for Goering due to some more reasons.
Это был очень сложный процесс вывода Германии из вот этого
No one knew the way Germany would have behaved after capitulation within the forthcoming transitional period, extremely uneasy leading out of the fascist regime under the Führer the country had been living in during the last several decades.
Фюрер-принципа, из вот этого оголтелого нацизма на этот переходный
And for that transition, there could have been a necessity in a personality from the Nazi circles.
нацистских гонс.
Playing with Dr. Gilbert, Goering had a bonus. While a lot of influential politicians and businessmen of the Atlantic world had initially supported empowering Nazis, some of them had been personal guests of Goering even more than once. After the war, both the Americans and the Brits needed not only his confession, but silence as well. Keeping silence there at Nuremberg, Goering, from his side, hoped for their further support.
И Черчилль там был замазан.
And Churchill participated as well as financing something and getting profit over there.
Получает свою выгоду, но об этом пока...
While corresponding documents are not open as yet, it is uneasy to state anything for sure.
Сейчас что-то с уверенностью утверждать.
Goering had seldom meetings with his family at Nuremberg. Once, he even cried to tears when his wife Emma visited him in prison together with his daughter. Right those days, they talked about the Nuremberg trials, about mass murders at the German death camps. As proof, the Soviet accuser demonstrated a documentary. Firstly, the cameraman installed the film incorrectly, and the shots started running out vice versa. But then the film was installed and shown as it was to be, so that the people sitting in the hall grew numb with horror, and Goering turned away.
Я думаю, он остается, как и 20 лет назад, один из главных...
He was, and he is, same as years ago, one of the principal military criminals.
Это очень большая ответственность на истребление, можно так сказать, на
People
коммунистов.
start understanding he bears a big personal responsibility for eliminating communists and Jews.
И что он тоже был один из организаторов войны, и поэтому, я думаю, он остается...
As a criminal, Goering stands in the same rank with Hitler, Himmler, and others of the kind.
Он остается, как можно сказать, великий четверку или пятерку.
Time passed, bringing no results in the Goering matter. Though there was a lot of changes in the world. The Americans burst their nuclear bomb. The Russians brought communists to power in their sector of occupation. Churchill spoke at Fulton. The global withstanding of superpowers emerged on the horizon. And Goering still kept silent. It became obvious that a further work with him would have taken even more time, demanding fulfillment of giving promises. But the latter seemed to be not possible, considering that his forgiveness was excluded. Otherwise, the entire Nuremberg trials process would have turned into a knockabout farce. Probably the final decision on the fate of Goering belonged not to the intelligence service officers, but to the American and British leaders. They considered anything could be fulfilled by their special services. Eventually, they arrived at an agreement as follows. Goering was to die in the eyes of the world, having been kept alive in reality. The CIA had been energetically preparing the operation. Within its framework, a new preparation was to be used. The one to make the human being a breathless corpse for only a few hours, not to attract a lot of attention from the side of American, Soviet, and British medical specialists. The supposed death was to occur on the very eve of the execution. While the body of a different person would have been burning in the oven, Goering was to depart to meet his long-hoped-for freedom.
Геринг ведь был наркоманом. На это не надо закрывать глаза.
It is worth reminding, Goering had been a drug addict, and when they started preparing him, giving him tiny doses of that stuff, his organism did not react to in an adequate way.
Реагировать не совсем адекватно. То есть у Геринга не снижалась температура.
His temperature did not go down, his pulse did not slow down,
Сильно, мощно работало сердце. То есть этот препарат
and his heart went on working as usual.
а не на его физику. И вот когда
In other words, that preparation influenced his mentality instead of his physics. Eventually, full amount of the stuff given to Goering at the moment requested to make him fall into anabiosis caused a malfunction.
произошел сбой.
The version of the supposed suicide of Goering would have failed if it were not for a document enlightening the secret of his death. The document was delivered by Dr. Gilbert to the sister of Hess, 20 years after the end of the Nuremberg trials. This is the stenographer paper of the meeting between Robert Ley and one strange man who introduced himself as the cook of General Marshall. Was he in fact a drug baron or an agent provocateur? We do not know that. The cook suggested Ley to establish a big army in a Latin American country to defend drug business there. He hinted Germany could have rebirth as a center of power through the union with the drug mafia. As the cook suggested, the money required for implementing all these operations were to be taken from the German stocks hidden in the Alps. The end of the conversation is of the most interest. Herr Ley, in case you agree, you should only rely on our medical man. Just close your eyes. When you open them, you will find yourself in the middle of the ocean. It seems Goering, having closed his eyes on October 15, 1946, believed he would have opened them in the middle of the ocean, on the way to his freedom. He drank the preparation, but did not fall asleep. An agony started. It lasted 3 hours, 47 minutes. But to accomplish a suicide, there are kinds of quick poison of immediate influence.
22 часа 45 минут.
Goering died at 10:45 p.m. At 10:40, he was still alive.
Кто стоял у его двери, видел еще.
But then there were convulsions, and in 5 minutes, it was over.
Руки лежат на одеяле.
The doctors who rushed in immediately could do nothing.
Через 5 минут, когда он
Who gave the ampoule with poison to Goering is unknown for sure until today. The official statement on the death of Goering had been prepared and signed by American and British medical specialists, but in reality, nobody ever saw that statement.
До сих пор все-таки на 100% не выяснено.
Вот это официальное заключение о
They only saw the document signed by the four sides already.
американскими и английскими врачами. Вот этого официального заключения.
And in this very secondary document, the figure of 5 hours 43, or maybe 53 minutes, I do not remember it for sure, is reflected.
Написан 4 сторонами. Вот в этом вторичном документе вот отражена вот эта самая цифра.
This is a big enigma. This paper exists, it is located in the archives, and historians know it.
Большая загадка. Этот документ
But they prefer to avoid talking about the paper, for this document is not to be as easily explained.
потому что его очень трудно объяснить.
Only one possible explanation is left. It should have been a really strong medical stuff to bring Goering into a temporary state resembling real death. But the organism of the drug addict did not cope with the burden, and the planned adventure did not come true. All his secrets Goering had taken away with him. By the night of October 1946, 3 black gallows had been erected in the sports hall of the Nuremberg prison. To make it quicker, they hung them one by one, even bringing in another Nazi while the previous one was still up there. Each of them said a farewell word. Be happy, Germany. Brunner whispered, the Bolsheviks will hang you also someday. Strayer cried out, I followed 2 million German soldiers perished for the motherland. Keitel exclaimed. As soon as 2:45, everything was over. The guards opened the doors, brought in the stretchers carrying one more dead body, the one of Hermann Goering, and the meeting between him and the gallows did happen. But by that moment, for the Reichsmarschall, it was all the same. Nothing was left from him on the earth, and he hardly left a personal trace in history. Though he had dreamt of, here is he, a war criminal, defendant of the International Tribunal, and here is he again, a bit earlier. Not the defendant, but imprisoned already. And even earlier over here, with the Reichsmarschall wand in his hand. It is impossible not to recognize him, for his photos and images had been spread all over by photographers and comic caricature artists of the entire world. Goering with an axe, Goering together with his dear little daughter. And on this photo, he is not a Nazi as yet, but a brave hero of the air battles of the First World War. In his childhood, he loved the hills and the height. He dreamt he had the wings to lift him high above all people of the world. After his dead body had been burnt, the dust of him was dispersed by the wind.